She was not born into power, nor raised among marble halls or silken curtains. Her story began in the dust of the Korean countryside, where the Mongol Empire collected its tribute not in gold, but in human beings, girls taken from their homes and shipped to the Yuan capital like livestock. Among those trembling captives was a young girl named Gi. Her family could do nothing as she was dragged away, another nameless face swallowed by an empire that stretched across continents. No one imagined that this girl, frightened, silent, barefoot, would rise to command emperors and armies, reshape a collapsing dynasty, and become one of the most feared and influential women in East Asian history. When she first arrived in the Yuan palace, she was barely more than a shadow, surrounded by thousands of other concubines and servants, each trying to survive the brutal politics of the harem. The palace itself was a labyrinth of suspicion, luxury, and danger. A single misstep could end in exile, poisoning, or disappearance. But the young Gi did something almost unheard of. She adapted. She observed. She learned. She mastered the art of silence before she ever spoke a word that mattered. And then, she was noticed. Emperor Togon Timur, a ruler born into grandeur yet twisted by paranoia and isolation, found himself fascinated by her calm eyes and quiet intelligence. She did not beg for his attention like others. She did not flatter him. She simply existed with a stillness he had never seen. And for a man who trusted no one, not his advisors, not his generals, not even his own family, that stillness was intoxicating. Slowly the emperor drew her closer. A night here, a conversation there. And the lower concubines began to whisper. Soon even the high-ranking women, those born into noble clans, started to feel the shift in the palace wind. A girl from Goryeo, a foreigner, was becoming the emperor's obsession. The court did not like this. The queen despised it. The ministers feared it. Because whenever an emperor falls in love, the empire itself begins to tilt. But Empress Gi did not rise by beauty alone. She was clever, sharper than the jade ornaments that hung from imperial robes. She understood that affection is not power, control is. And so she studied the empire, its fractures, its dying economy, its corrupt ministers, its growing rebellions. She watched how the emperor trusted no one yet longed for someone to guide him. In this weakness she found her doorway. Her influence grew in whispers. A recommendation for an official here, a dismissal there, a small favor granted to a foreign merchant, a quiet punishment for an enemy. At first her actions seemed harmless. But beneath the surface she was building something, an invisible network loyal only to her. And then came the moment that changed everything. She gave birth to a son. A foreign concubine giving the emperor an heir was political dynamite. The noble families were horrified. The queen was humiliated. And the court, fearing that a Korean woman might become mother of the future emperor, unleashed a storm of accusations, conspiracies, and assassination attempts. But each attempt failed. Each accusation vanished. Each conspirator met a quiet, tragic end. Because by then, she was no longer just a concubine. She was becoming the woman behind the throne. The emperor, weakened by luxury and indecision, leaned on her like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Soon, decrees were issued in her name. Provinces were reorganized at her request. Envoys bowed to her before they bowed to the emperor. She became richer, more powerful, and more feared than almost every noble clan in the empire. Rebels spoke her name as a curse. Ministers trembled before her. Enemies disappeared without explanation. And yet, for all her rising power, something dark was stirring beyond the palace walls. Famine spread. Rebellions erupted. The empire was cracking under the weight of corruption and misrule. But inside the palace, the emperor saw none of it, hidden behind walls of silk and illusion, walls she did not tear down, because they protected her and placed the empire's fate entirely in her hands. But even Empress Gi could not stop the truth forever. For the first time in her life, she began to sense a shadow larger than any she had faced before. An enemy not within the palace, but an entire nation beginning to question why a foreign woman controlled their throne. Angry whispers grew louder in the streets. The rebels marching toward the capital did not speak only of corrupt officials or cruel tax collectors. They spoke of her. And in the midst of this rising storm, She made a decision that would shock the world and seal her fate. Her ambition outgrew even the empire. She would not simply rule through the emperor anymore. She would rule as the empire's true sovereign, and eliminate anyone who stood in her way. But power gained in shadows is power easily lost. And soon, Empress Gi would learn that the world she controlled could vanish just as quickly as she rose to claim it. The fall of a dynasty never begins with a single crack. It begins with thousands, small, invisible, ignored. Throughout the empire, the people whispered that the emperor had surrendered his throne not to an army, not to an enemy state, but to a woman from a conquered land. To many, this was an humiliation greater than foreign invasion. To others, it was the final sign that heaven had withdrawn its blessing from the Mongol rulers. But inside the palace, Emperor Togon Timur saw none of it. He saw only her. And that blindness would prove fatal. As rebellions grew, Empress Gi tightened her grip. She understood something the emperor never could. When a dynasty begins to collapse, the throne belongs not to the gentle but to the ruthless. She expanded her private guard. She built alliances with generals who answered only to her. She had spies in every office, every banquet, every whispering corner of the palace. Nothing escaped her ears. But her greatest weapon, her son, was still not recognized as heir. And that was the one battlefield she could not conquer with whispers and manipulation. The noble clans despised her son, calling him the foreign prince, the corrupted heir, the shame of the empire. They wanted a Mongol child on the throne, not a boy whose blood came from a conquered kingdom. Every day that passed without recognition was a day she felt her grip slipping. So she made her move. Under the cover of illness, she convinced the emperor that only her son could protect the dynasty. She spoke of omens, visions, dreams sent by heaven. She fed him stories of conspiracies against the boy's life, plots to poison him, generals who would overthrow the emperor once the child died. Whether the emperor believed her or simply feared losing the only person he trusted, he relented. Her son was elevated. Not fully heir, but close enough to ignite a political firestorm that shook the palace walls. The nobles erupted. Ministers resigned. Courtiers vanished. And within weeks, the palace had become a battlefield cloaked in silk. Empress Gi, however, moved with the precision of a blade. She removed her enemies one by one, some through exile, others through execution, and a few through disappearances so quiet that no one dared ask questions. But in gaining ground, she made a fatal mistake. She underestimated her oldest enemy, the Empress Dowager. The Empress Dowager, old but far from powerless, began to gather those who feared Gi's rise. Officials, generals, nobles, all those who saw the dynasty slipping into the hands of a woman they viewed as a threat to the Mongol identity. And she had one thing Gi did not: legitimacy. Her signatures still carried weight. Her commands carried the memory of tradition. And while Empress Gi ruled through fear, the Empress Dowager rallied through loyalty. A silent war began. Every night, another official defected. Every week, another district rebelled. Every month, Empress Gi felt the empire slipping between her fingers. But she refused to surrender. If the empire was collapsing, she would not collapse with it. She made one last gamble, her most ambitious and most dangerous gamble of all. She summoned mercenary forces loyal only to her. She sent secret messengers to Korea, urging her homeland to support her. And she began crafting something unthinkable: a coup. A new dynasty. A throne not behind the emperor, but above him. Many historians still argue whether she intended to proclaim herself ruler or simply place her son on the throne and rule through him. But inside the palace, her intentions were clear enough. For the first time, her enemies truly feared that she intended to overthrow the emperor entirely. And they were right. But before she could act, before her armies were fully assembled, before her plans solidified, the world outside the palace erupted into chaos. The Red Turban Rebellion. An uprising so massive, so ferocious, that it swallowed entire cities in days. Provinces fell like leaves in a storm. Mongol armies were slaughtered, villages burned, governors executed. The rebels marched not for gold or power, they marched to destroy the dynasty itself. And they were heading straight for the capital. Inside the palace, panic spread like wildfire. Ministers screamed advice, generals shouted warnings, concubines prayed, slaves hid in corners. For the first time, Empress Gi saw something she had not felt in years, the possibility of losing everything. And the emperor, weak, terrified, confused, turned to her, his eyes pleading for answers. But she was out of answers. She had fought off nobles, ministers, assassins, rival factions, but she could not fight an entire nation. The walls were closing in. All that remained was her final plan, a desperate attempt to escape the collapsing empire with her son. She did not know where the rebels were, how far they had come, or whether her own supporters were still loyal. And in this panic, a strange irony unfolded. The emperor fled without her. He abandoned her, the woman who had shaped his rule, defended him, elevated him, and protected him for years. Whether out of fear, confusion, or betrayal, he left her behind, in a palace about to fall. And so the most powerful woman in the Yuan dynasty found herself suddenly alone. The rebels were coming. The empire was burning. Her networks were crumbling. Her enemies were closing in. And the world she had conquered through cunning, strategy, and fear was collapsing beneath her feet. What happened next is one of history's most mysterious disappearances, one that scholars debate even today. The fall of a dynasty is never silent. When the rebels finally stormed the capital, the city erupted in screams, fire, and collapsing stone. The Yuan imperial guards, once feared across continents, broke like brittle twigs under the rebels' fury. Servants fled. Ministers hid. Royal banners burned in the night wind. And inside the palace, at the center of this raging storm, Empress Gi vanished. Some claimed she fought her way through secret tunnels beneath the palace, clutching her son as flames roared above them. Others whispered that she disguised herself as a servant and slipped into the chaos, no longer a queen but a ghost. A few insisted that loyal soldiers smuggled her out under cover of darkness. And yet there were darker rumors that she never escaped at all. In the weeks after the rebellion, several rebel leaders claimed they had captured a high-ranking royal woman. None could prove it. Others said the rebels found her body in the palace, lifeless but untouched, as though she had simply laid down and resigned herself to fate. But no burial record exists. No grave. No official statement. Nothing. It was as if the most powerful woman in the empire had evaporated into the smoke of its destruction. Meanwhile, the emperor, her emperor, found refuge hundreds of miles away. History paints him as a tragic figure, fleeing the ruins of his empire with nothing but a few loyal followers. Yet in those early months of exile, he said nothing of the woman who had dominated his reign. Not a word. No search parties. No proclamations. No mourning. Scholars still debate whether this silence was guilt, fear, or something colder. But one thing is certain. He reclaimed his throne only in name. The Yuan dynasty survived in the north, but it was a hollow shell. And in that hollow shell, the memory of Empress Gi became dangerous. Too powerful. Too influential. Too tied to the dynasty's humiliations. So the court began to erase her, slowly, deliberately, methodically. Her decrees were rewritten. Her titles removed. Her supporters eliminated. Her enemies rewarded. And her very existence was sanitized from official history. But forgetting someone like her is not so easy. Because while the Mongol court erased her, Korea remembered her differently. In her homeland she was not a traitor, nor a villain, nor a foreign sorceress who bewitched an emperor. She was a girl stolen from her village who rose to rule one of the largest empires on earth. A woman who survived politics that destroyed countless others. A strategist who outmaneuvered generals, nobles, and even emperors. A mother who risked everything for her son. And a ruler who shaped the twilight years of the Yuan dynasty with a force few women in history ever wielded. Yet even in Korea, her memory faded into fragments. Folk tales, rumors, contradictory accounts. As if no one could decide who she truly was. A villain? A victim? A genius? A tyrant? Or all of them at once? The truth lies somewhere in the space between. What we know is this. When the capital fell, she disappeared into history's darkest corner, leaving behind a trail of suspicion, fear, admiration, and unresolved questions. Her body was never found. Her exile never recorded. Her end never confirmed. And the empire she once controlled crumbled so completely that no one was left to preserve the final chapter of her life. In the centuries that followed, new dynasties rose and fell. New empires carved their names into the earth. But every historian who searches the imperial archives eventually stumbles upon the same cold, unsettling realization. The world did not forget Empress Gi by accident. She was erased. And that is perhaps the greatest mystery of all, not how she lived but why so many worked so hard to hide how it all ended. Did she escape into obscurity, living her final days as a nameless wanderer far from the courts she once commanded? Was she captured and executed, her death concealed to avoid inflaming her supporters? Did her own allies betray her, fearing that her ambition would not stop even as the empire burned? Or did she quietly, calmly descend into the shadows, accepting that a woman like her could leave only one legacy, fear? We do not know. We may never know. But the truth is this. The girl taken as tribute became an empress. The empress became the shadow ruler of an empire. The shadow ruler became the most feared woman in East Asia. And then, she vanished, leaving behind only a question that has echoed for centuries. What really happened to Empress Gi? And why was the world so desperate to erase her?